I think we all know that this is an incredibly formative time, not just in cybersecurity, but in the world. COVID-19 has rapidly changed many of our infrastructures, from the way that we engage with governments to how companies operate in remote environments to many different things in between. Today, though, we're going to focus on one such aspect, which is how COVID-19 has affected cybersecurity resilience. And I'm thrilled to be able to host a conversation around the different pieces of that conversation, from issues such as network infrastructure to misinformation to building a remote workforce that works for us all. So I'd like to bring in our panel, but first I do want to acknowledge that we were supposed to have a larger panel. We unfortunately had several cancellations this morning. What that also means is that we unfortunately also have a non-diverse panel. We are more white and more gender specific than we would like to be. And so we all wanted to acknowledge that as a panel, that this is a bit different than we'd hoped to go forward, but we still wanted to have this important conversation. And so I hope you know that we will try better for the future. So I'd like to introduce first Misha, who is an award-winning journalist and historian, and he's currently a research fellow at the Berggruen Institute in LA. And I'm going to ask Misha one question, and then I'll do the same to our other panelist, Robert. So Misha, what is the single biggest change in the cybersecurity ecosystem that you have noticed in response to COVID-19?
Well, I think it's a quantitative issue. In as much that we have seen an acceleration away from office-based working to home-based working. And this creates all sorts of new problems for people involved in cybersecurity, because essentially when you're largely office-based workers, then there is the perimeter which cybersecurity engineers, CISOs can monitor, can watch, and so on. As soon as you go out, when you get, over 50% of your workforce suddenly working from home, then your vulnerabilities multiply, largely because, of course, when you're working from home, you're on a router that is probably much more vulnerable to infiltration than servers in the office. But also, you've got your teenage kids playing on those routers, doing all sorts of things which you can't possibly monitor. And so the possibilities for people to infiltrate networks are just much, much higher. And this anticipates another issue which will be very important, and that is digital transformation in general, where much of the work is going to move outside of the perimeter into the cloud. And that is bringing with it very, very specific challenges that people are having to engage with at the moment.
Thank you so much, Misha. I'm really looking forward to unpacking that with you. But first, I also want to bring into the conversation Robert Hannigan, who's the chairman of BlueVoyant, a cybersecurity services company. He's the former director of GCHQ, as many of you know, and also helped to establish the UK National Cybersecurity Centre. Thanks so much for being here, Robert. Same question to you. What is the biggest single change that you see in the cybersecurity ecosystem? Do you agree with Misha?
Hi, Betsy. Yeah, and everybody. Of course, I agree with Misha. I think it's not that working from home is inherently insecure. Lots of people have done it very securely for years, but usually that's after a long process and careful process by their company to ensure that they've got the training and the kit and the connectivity that is necessary to do stuff securely. What's happened in the last 3 months is that we've all gone through that process in a couple of days, sometimes certainly a couple of weeks in most companies, and that's bound to introduce insecurities, as Misha says, and I'm sure we'll be exploring some of those, because criminals and nation states, all cyber attackers, are opportunistic. They can spot those technical insecurities. The one thing I'd add to Misha's point is there's also a human dimension to this. So people are very afraid in this lockdown, this pandemic, and they want information, especially on the pandemic. So that's why we've seen so much of the fraud geared to COVID-related phishing emails and COVID-related websites, fake websites, because it's playing on people's natural human instincts, and that's what fraudsters do. So it's both a technical exploitation of working from home and a human exploitation.
Really important. And so for today's conversation, we're going to run this essentially as a fireside chat. I will jump in on occasion and also ask Robert and Misha questions. I would encourage the audience, help us out. We'd love to hear what you're interested in. Please ask follow-ups. Please give us what you're really interested in learning about, because we could take this conversation in so many directions, and we'd really like to take it in the direction that you're most interested in. But so first, let's try to break down the pieces of this sort of complex problem between COVID, cybersecurity, cyber resilience. Let's start with the threat landscape. So Robert, how has the threat landscape changed in your opinion in light of COVID-19? I've heard a lot about ransomware increasing. You just mentioned phishing. Are those the big key trends that you're seeing right now?
Well, I think, the cyber industry has a self-interest in telling everybody everything is getting worse and the pandemic's been a disaster in cyber. And, that isn't the case. Insofar as you can get accurate data on cyber, which is really tough, but the government and some of the big companies like Microsoft, have great data. And the overall volume of cyber attacks doesn't seem to have increased. There aren't more cyber attackers around. They're there doing the same things. And in some areas of fraud, actually, it's declined, I guess, because some of those fraudsters are having their own lockdown problems. But what's happened is, as Misha's already said, there's been a refocusing of that cyber activity towards COVID-related opportunities. So the work from home technical opportunity, but also playing on people's fears. And the one area where we have seen an exponential rise in attacks is on the healthcare sector. So on pharma companies, on hospitals and the healthcare system, certainly in the UK here, and on universities that are developing the world's most precious intellectual property, which is anything to do with a vaccine or effective treatment for COVID. So that's where we've seen a huge growth. But it isn't an overall explosion of cyber activity. It's a refocusing of it in quite a cynical, predictable, and opportunistic way. Ransomware, you mentioned, is absolutely on the rise, but it's been on the rise for a couple of years now. There was a time back in 2016 after the big international ransomware attacks we all read about, WannaCry, NotPetya, where we said ransomware was a thing of the past. It never went away. And it's got more sophisticated, it's gone up market, it's more targeted now, it's delivered in more sophisticated ways, especially through the supply chain, through the software into companies, and it's higher value now. So the average ransom that I was certainly seeing 5 years ago was really low. It was sort of $20, $30, $40, $100, $150. Now there are ransoms of $500,000 and more. So that's changing. And if you talk to anybody in financial services or pharma at the moment, ransomware is a huge problem. So that is one trend, I think, coming out of not just the pandemic, but maybe last year, I suppose.
Fantastic. And not surprising that the healthcare sector would be growing, but it's actually somewhat reassuring to hear that maybe though we're seeing more of it, the actual trends are not towards a sudden everybody's at home and so now there's more malicious actors. But Misha, what about the business of being a bad guy? Do you think that cyber criminals are adapting their business models in meaningful ways to the crisis? Is this capitalizing on new opportunities? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, certainly, as Robert said, what we've seen is a lot of the frauds are using people's anxieties about COVID, either to set up websites that have got malware hidden in them and which can infect your computers if you go on, or just doing usual boiler room frauds like selling non-existent masks, selling tests for COVID, for example. That's quite a big issue. And we're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of websites and operations doing this across the whole world, and it's been a big money maker. I think Robert's absolutely correct to highlight the health sector. One interesting thing about the health sector is that actually traditionally pharmaceutical companies have probably had the best cyber defenses of any sector at all. And the vulnerability, as he highlights, is actually in the secondary area which is whole healthcare, hospital facilities, and so on. And there has been a massive shift over to these facilities in terms of attacks, and that is telling us something about who's after this type of material. A lot of it is backed by state actors rather than non-state actors. But there's also, I think it's important to emphasize what Robert was saying, is that some of these tendencies we were seeing a growth in over the past couple of years anyhow. A very important one, I think, that is often not highlighted is, and it's usually associated with ransomware, is attacks on city infrastructures, municipal infrastructures. Because what happens there is you're going for networks of organizations, municipal governments, who don't have very many resources in terms of cybersecurity, but upon whom many businesses, many institutions depend. So we've seen this in Atlanta, we've seen it in Dublin, we've seen it in Ottawa, we've seen it all over the place. And this is something that I hope COVID is going to help with, because there are some structural, some systemic issues which we need to address. First and foremost is the dearth of cybersecurity engineers around the world in every country. And what that means is that when it comes to things like criminality on the web, you need to have a shift in the way you do your policing. So your police force needs to be recruiting cybersecurity professionals in order to deal with the shift of a lot of crime over to the internet. Now, the problem with that is that a police officer is going to be earning something in the region of between $30,000 and $40,000 here in the United Kingdom, whereas if he or she were to go and work for Google, they would be earning 3-5 times as much as that, and the hemorrhaging of really good professionals who are often trained by the state in places like Robert's former employer GCHQ, and then go over to the private sector, means that it's state institutions and forms of criminality which the state takes care of that are particularly vulnerable going forward. And that means addressing, and this is something we can talk about later, addressing the issue of education in schools.
Yeah, I'd really like to pick that up in a second on the skills point. I completely agree with everything Misha said, Betsy. But I just to finish off on the pharma, I think Misha's absolutely right that big pharma companies are used to spending tens, in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars on their cybersecurity. They're really good at it. They hire the best people. Although I was talking to one CISO the other day who said he's seen a 150% increase in attacks on his networks, which is an interesting indication. But the problem for them, along with all big business and financial services too, is supply chain. So they probably got 10,000 vendors if they're a really big company, they're a big bank or a pharma company. Each one of those represents a threat to them, a soft way in. And we're seeing both nation states and increasingly criminals not bothering to attack the core network of a big company because they're spending so much on it, but going in through a soft supply chain company. Anything from a software company to a lawyer to a marketing company to somebody who's probably not well protected, but they're a brilliant way in. And we've seen nation state attacks delivered against the energy sector in the US through a lawyer, and it's a real lawyer, so somebody they trust. They've just managed to take over their inbox and deliver a spear phishing email that way from a trusted vendor. And why wouldn't you click on your lawyer's email? So this is the thing that everybody is now worrying about and trying to quantify that risk and categorize it and prioritize it.
I think that's really important, and I want to come back both to the skills point in a minute. But first, so on this point about social engineering, you just gave an excellent example. I believe we just saw the release of several others, including ExxonMobil related scams that led to a number of organizations being compromised in the sort of pro-climate sector. We received a question from the audience which asked, social engineering or technical vulnerabilities, has the balance changed? Do either of you think that balance has changed since COVID came along?
I'll come in on that just to talk from the perspective of people engaged in hacking activity, because over the years I've interviewed and got to know quite a lot of criminal hackers. And one of the most interesting things about hacking as a crime is that the people who are engaged in this generally tend to be from a different social and economic profile than those involved in traditional organized crime. One of the most fascinating aspects is that of social engineering, because to be a social engineer, and it's something between 80 and 90% of all attacks start with a phishing expedition of some form or other at the moment, still to this day. To be a social engineer, you don't need to know anything about computing whatsoever. It helps if you're working with someone who does know things about computing, but basically what you have to know about is human vulnerability. And these people are very sort of flamboyant and they're fascinating by human psychology, and they're very good at reading it. So it's that the emphasis that we've had, particularly in the cybersecurity industry, on technical solutions to the problem is never going to get there unless you balance it out with the issue of psychological human issues to cybersecurity. Now, up until now, I've always argued that the human factor is the biggest vulnerability in cybersecurity. And I still think that for the moment that remains the case. However, and I'll be very interested to hear what Robert has to say about this, as we move towards digital transformation, a shifting of all your activities outside of your company to service providers in the cloud, as we see the introduction of more and more things on the Internet of Things, and you start to get a proliferation of machine-to-machine learning, then it is theoretically perfectly possible, and I believe that this is likely, that, I mean, the one great thing about cybersecurity is that you have an engineer, a human being who knows what they're talking about, monitoring everything that's going on. As you move towards machine-to-machine learning and in the Internet of Things, then you're depending ever more on machines to provide your security. And what happens if your opponents, who are always thinking 1-2 steps ahead of you, find a way of manipulating machines, of breaking down those machines' defenses? Then you're in real trouble. So theoretically, it's perfectly possible that in 3, 4, 5 years' time, humans won't be the main vulnerability anymore. It will actually be machines. And that's something going forward that the entire industry has got to think about.
So before I let Robert jump in on that point, I want to add another from the audience, which is, do you see cybercriminals and adversary adopting artificial intelligence as part of their toolkit to launch new kinds of attacks? So in addition to the social engineering technical vulnerabilities debate, does AI change that equation?
Well, do you want me to pick that up? I mean, let me first of all, just on the social engineering, I think one of the reasons it's got so much better, as Misha has said, is there's so much more information for criminals to draw on. So 10 years ago, if you got a spear phishing email, it was probably misspelt and very obviously fake. Today, they've done their research. So the best example I came across was a bank CEO, actually, who had got an email that looked like it was from his son's school. And it was asking for him to sort of urgently look at a document. Now, it was perfectly researched. They'd obviously gone onto his social media, seen where his child went to school, looked at the website for the school, made an email address that looked convincing, and sent it. And as clever stuff, took a bit of research, and as Misha says, it wasn't probably somebody who was a technical expert doing that. It was somebody who was a good researcher. So you can do social engineering on a new scale thanks to social media, frankly. There's just much more public information about all of us out there all the time. And I agree with Misha's point that as automation kicks in, I mean, the only way that we're going to be able to cope, frankly, with cybersecurity is through automation. And the most successful companies in the future will be the most highly automated in security. There will be some new vulnerabilities as a result of that. Personally, I think the baseline of security will rise because machines will be better at this than, I mean, taking the human error out of this, and human vulnerability will be overall a good thing, but there will be some problems too. On AI, there's been a huge amount of talk about this, and everybody is saying, well, criminals are using AI and nation states are using AI. I think there's very little evidence of this. Where there is some evidence and anecdote in the industry is, seeing people using AI to probe vulnerabilities. It's an obvious use of AI to take a lot of data about vulnerabilities and networks and look for new opportunities. So that's kind of obvious, I think, as a use, but so far I think there's more talk about it than reality. But it will be a big feature in the future. Most cybersecurity companies of any scale are already using AI in defense. But machine learning is good for attack. So there's bound to come a time when criminals get good at using machine learning to find weaknesses in people's defenses. It's only really a matter of time.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm most worried about is the effectiveness of targeting people at scale in the social engineering attacks that you've talked about. If you can mine Twitter accounts and create really effective phishing, emails at scale, that's going to really change the nature of how we think about protecting. And it's going to make it a lot more difficult because right now a lot of the filtering happens because the emails are very specific. And I don't think that will be possible if it continues in that direction. So I want to make sure we get the other side of the equation is, what do we do about all of these changes in light of COVID and beyond? So first, Robert, let's talk a little bit about what companies are doing. Has the pandemic changed the way companies are approaching cyber resilience, and should it?
Well, it certainly should. I mean, I think companies are torn in two directions at the moment. So at the start of the pandemic, for many companies, it was, how do we survive? For others, it was, how do we keep operating? And survival might not have been the issue. So that was the first priority. Security probably came a little bit later. I think there have had to be some compromises around security and some different approaches to risk, to managing risk in companies. And I've seen quite a bit of that happening. And it's not necessarily a bad thing at all, actually. But companies are, on the one hand, saying cybersecurity is our top priority. Because it's the thing that will keep us functioning remotely. At the same time, they're under huge pressure to cut spending. So I've seen companies pulled in both directions, wanting to prioritize this, but also not being allowed to spend money. That is really difficult. I think most sophisticated companies know they've got to take this seriously if they haven't already, and spend money on it as appropriate and try to get the skills they need. The answer to your question of what should companies do is, well, it's kind of boring, actually. If they should do the basics, get the basics right. Most cyber attacks, as Misha already said, are being delivered in pretty traditional ways. They're exploiting well-known vulnerabilities, human and technical. There's not a lot of rocket science happening in this pandemic, and there are some clever things happening at the nation-state level. But on the whole, most cyber attacks are delivered through traditional vectors and exploiting traditional weaknesses. So doing the right thing, having the right policies in place, getting the right advice and technical kit, either outsourcing it or buying it in yourself, things that companies would do normally if they were wanting to work from home. And I probably haven't had time to do in the measured way they would, but that's the urgent priority. And there's plenty of really good advice, free advice out there from governments, UK, US, and elsewhere. So it isn't that difficult, but it takes some organization and discipline and some money to do.
And so, Misha, just following up on that, we also know that companies are not operating in a complete COVID-19 vacuum. Even before COVID, as we've acknowledged, there's been a broader digital transformation, the Internet of Things that we mentioned earlier, and these already presented challenges to security, including especially to cloud security. So I'd just love to hear, what do you think companies should be doing to respond in light of all these trends?
Well, one thing where I've always felt that there is, a slight imbalance in terms of the cybersecurity industry is, as I mentioned earlier, the focus on technical solutions to problems. So if you're looking at the human dimension, what you want to look for, if you're a company that is looking for services, for cybersecurity services, is you want to look for those companies which are able to combine digital intelligence with human intelligence, and also the ability to train people up. I actually think that the fact that we're all sitting at home during COVID, and I mean, people like me who spend most of their time sitting at home anyhow, it doesn't make much difference. But for a lot of people, they've got time on their hands. And it is actually, as Robert said, the basics of cybersecurity are not that difficult. It comes down to 10 or so basic rules, and you just have to teach yourself how to do that. I mean, one of the things we haven't mentioned at the moment is that one of the biggest money spinners over the web is BEC, business email compromise, or CEO fraud, as it's called, when you get a phishing email saying, from somebody that looks like they're from your own company, saying, can you pay that invoice for $75,000, which you haven't done up until now. And you would be amazed how many senior executives, I mean, this runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The FBI monitor how much money goes out through BEC. You'd be amazed how many people fall for this. So one of the things you can do, Robert mentioned again a very important thing about the sophistication of the use of language by people involved in hacking. They now know how to write English properly, or if they're working in Portuguese or Spanish, how to write those languages properly. And so you don't detect straight away. Anytime you look at an email, whoever it's from, you have to make an immediate calculation, and you should do this consciously, of saying, is that the way that this person, who I know, and particularly those people who know, obviously, is this the way that they write to me? Are they good when it comes to punctuation? Are they bad spellers? And things like this. And this has to be automatic. It's really not rocket science at all. All sorts of things that people can teach themselves. And now during COVID, I think it's a very good time to do it.
Well, we all have a little bit more time on our hands, at least without the travel. So we appreciate that. So Misha, sticking with you for a second, what about nation states? Have you seen any change in the behavior of states in light of the COVID pandemic as it speaks to cybersecurity?
Well, the answer is yes. When I speak to people who I know from intelligence services or private intelligence companies, they tell me that there has been a significant ramping up, first of all, in the issue of looking for COVID-related solutions of one sort or another. But also, it's a great opportunity for nation state to go on, on espionage exercises. We've seen, there's been a lot of spats recently between Iran, Israel, and Saudi, for example. That network there, that sort of triangle there, and there is significant evidence about increased Chinese activity as well. But let's be frank about this. Since 2010, since Stuxnet, we've known that nation states are penetrating other nation states' networks all the time. It's basically become their job. If you make the assumption that cyber espionage is a necessarily preemptive activity, and you assume that everyone is up to it all the time, that in my opinion should be your starting point. Then what you try and do is identify who is targeting what and why, what are the motives here, and trying to link up also MOs of cyber attack with particular regions, with particular nationalities at the moment. And as I say, as far as I understand, we had that big rush that Robert alluded to of stuff coming out of Russia with Petya, not Petya, and so on. the Russians appear to have been relatively modest in recent months, but I'm sure it's pretty much business as usual. What we do have coming up, of course, is the election in the United States, and that is already a matter of deep, deep concern, because what happened with the Russian interest in interfering with elections, referenda, and so on in the West is the Russians basically realized that they were no longer in a position to maintain parity when it came to technology and weapon systems with the United States and China. So on a political level, they moved towards China. On a technical level, they thought, right, well, if we can't keep up with the weaponry, let's have a look and see what the vulnerabilities of the political and social systems of our opponents and potential opponents are. And in the West, post-2008, with politics in chaos, it was a slam dunk to use social media to create chaos. Now, I don't think that Putin necessarily cares whether it's Trump or whether it's Biden who gets in November. What I think he does enjoy is seeing the dysfunctionality of Western political systems, which is partly, of his making. I'm sure he feels good about that. And I think come November, this is going to be a significant issue.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in many ways, it's been business as usual for nation states with lots of new opportunities. And we've seen some Russian activity, GRU exploiting a particular vulnerability published recently by the NSA. So they're busy. We've had the joint UK and US governments talking about theft of IP from universities and pharma companies, China, Russia, and Iran. But in a sense, this is what they've always done. So we've seen Chinese attacks on universities across the West for at least 10 years and wholesale theft of intellectual property. So it just happens to be focused now on COVID, but it's not a new thing. And academic institutions are very hard to protect because academics they like to share and they don't necessarily think about security. And then I think the interesting incident that Misha mentioned between Iran and Israel, I think would have got much more publicity outside a pandemic. So this was, for people who hadn't caught up with it, this was the Iranians attacking a water treatment facility in Israel, and Israel responding by attacking a port facilities in Iran. This is a really interesting example of tactical use of offensive cyber to create an effect. And obviously, at the worst extreme, you could do a huge amount of damage to a population by affecting its water treatment, either by turning it off or by infecting it in some way, by getting the chemical imbalance, getting the balance wrong. So there's a hot war going on in cyber in the Gulf and has been for some years. But I thought this was a very interesting example. And I agree with everything that Misha said about the manipulation of politics. There's no reason to suggest that won't carry on happening and won't be increasing over the next year or so.
And so I run in my day job a policy incubator. We train technologists how to do policy so that they can get more engaged. So forgive me for asking the obvious question, but what do you wish nation states were doing? Are there policy solutions to some of the many problems we've teed up over the course of this conversation? So I'll give you a couple examples. One of the things that now seems increasingly clear is the importance of network infrastructure and the digital divide, especially in the United States, between rural and urban communities that don't have access to networks. Is there something we should be doing there? What about governments helping companies investigate attacks? Information sharing about cybersecurity has long been fraught. Should there be new things, or are there other policy ideas that you have that might be effective in this space?
Well, I'll be really interested to hear what Misha says about what governments could do about the social media political manipulation problem, because I'm kind of at a loss, and there's a very lively debate on that going on at the moment. I think on the technical side, lots of governments are either already regulating or talking about regulating cyber. and some of it's happened already in the European Union, on the privacy of data, but more importantly on utility companies, on essential services, critical national infrastructure. There are now cyber regulations, and there will be more to come. Everybody is talking about or doing regulation of the Internet of Things to try to raise the baseline of security, to make sure we're not going to be plugging in literally billions of new processors that are completely insecure, and making the problem worse for ourselves. So those are some things governments can do. They can mandate minimum standards in cybersecurity for their supply chain, for example, and that's already happening. It's happening in defense in a big way in the States at the moment. These are really sensible things to kind of raise the baseline. I think as well as doing that, we need to take a lot of the pressure off the individual. I think for a long time, our approach to cybersecurity has been just to tell people they're useless and say you should be doing this or that, you shouldn't have clicked on that. Actually, it's really hard sometimes to spot, especially if you're busy, a fake email. So the objective of governments should be probably to get more involved, which they certainly are in the UK and the US, and to do more of the defense themselves, to work with the private sector more, which is happening, and to try to both raise the baseline, work with insurance and regulation to improve standards, and then to go after those who are clearly making money out of this. So there's plenty to be done, and I'm an optimist in the long term. I just think it's going to be quite bumpy getting there.
And so let me ask that to Misha. I want to come back to the human element in just one moment, but before we turn to that, policy solutions, Misha, what are your priorities?
Well, I would say that here in the United Kingdom, we do pretty well. I don't know, I mean, Robert knows a lot more about this, but I've been pretty impressed by the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is the sort of public-facing department of GCHQ that has been operating for the past few years. And what the National Cybersecurity Centre does is it basically reaches out to anyone who has an issue with cyber and cybersecurity, whether in business, whether charities, whether government institutions or whatever. And I think this is posited on a recognition that with 90% of Britain's critical national infrastructure in private hands, government cannot provide security. The only thing that government can do is to coordinate security, to offer advice, and also using its, the considerable skills of things like GCHQ to react when something very serious happens. So on that level, I think GCHQ and the National Cybersecurity Centre are doing a good job. You have two types of, what shall I say, awareness about cybersecurity. You have awareness in terms of people involved in business, in companies, in corporations, and so on and so forth. And then you have a general social awareness. And what we have failed to do anywhere in the world is for people to grow up understanding that cybersecurity must be an essential part of their life. Now, the reason for that, in my opinion, is because cybersecurity and computers are, in essence, extremely boring subjects. And trying to get people interested in them is very, very hard, particularly when the only sort of imagery you have is somebody at a keyboard looking at a screen. It's witlessly boring. And actually,
that comes from a journalist, ladies and gentlemen.
I know. What we need to do, well, actually, what I'm involved at the moment. I'm writing a TV drama for the BBC, which is about a teenage hacker from the United Kingdom who gets involved with a hacking group, GCHQ, and so on and so forth. And one of the reasons why I'm motivated to do this is because I want people to understand that these days it's no good just outsourcing your security and your privacy to other people or to institutions or whatever. And that's why I'll go back briefly to the issue of schools, is that up to 4 years ago, which is when my last child left school, basically lessons on computers were still, how to use Excel and that sort of thing. And there were hackers inside the classes who were running rings around the school security system. Now, until we have, and this is a really serious systemic but very difficult issue, computing and cybersecurity from the earlier stages of schooling, we're going to have a problem. So it involves introducing things which are complex and systemic, but which I believe are very, very important if we're to arrive at that state that Robert was talking about, where things are much less rocky than they are now. One final thought on this, and this is really on the sort of macro big picture scale, is that this is, in terms of relations between states, an unregulated, incredibly powerful communications technology. And ultimately, a multilateral solution to the way that states and citizens use and interact with the internet. That is the only way that we're going to stop it from being an existential threat, which at the moment I believe it is. But it's a very, very hard nut to crack, because Western perceptions of what and how the internet should be used and other people's perceptions are fundamentally different. And at the moment, the gap looks unbridgeable.
Well, so I want to add a few ideas of my own to the policy conversation. First, I think that governments need to fund innovation in this space more. We are stuck in the past, both in terms of what we teach people and in terms of how we engage in government more broadly. I've learned in detail about how, certain infrastructures used by government are 20, 30 years old, and we haven't moved beyond that. And so, governments are bureaucratic. It's hard to push them along, but having small competitions in which you enable innovation and sandboxes in which regulations are not so formulated give people the opportunity to try new things. And I think that's really important. I'd also double down on the digital divide. I don't believe it's as severe in the UK as in the US, but for many children, they don't even have access to internet at home, and many parents have struggled. So one difference with COVID is not only is this education problem real, it also is getting even further divided, as US students will mostly not be going back to school this year at all and may not be progressing if they do not have access to the internet. That has to change. And then finally, and I'll transition this to a final question for the panel, the default rules that we need to think about here. If my router is insecure, why is there not a default setting that would enable me to have it be secure? Why does that rely on me to make those decisions? So especially when it comes to consumer products, governments can do more to give guidelines, to insist that we don't pick the easiest, quickest to market solution, to help consumers actually navigate that. And so I'd like to ask the panel one final rapid fire question, which is, what is your bumper sticker or key takeaway in terms of the relationship between cyber resilience and COVID-19? I'll give you my bumper sticker first, which is, COVID didn't change everything, but if we don't get remote work right, it might. Robert, Misha, what do you think?
I'd say educate yourself. Just take half an hour to look at a website on cybersecurity in any of our countries, and take some time to think through your own vulnerabilities, because we've got that time and we may as well use it well.
It's a little long for a bumper sticker, Robert, but we'll give it to you.
Yeah. Educate yourself is the bumper sticker.
Yeah, but basically I'd add a little bit to that bumper sticker saying governments aren't going to do it for you, companies aren't going to do it for you, you've got to do it yourself.
Well, I hope that can change, but I certainly think that reflects the reality. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Misha. It was my pleasure, and looking forward to continuing the conversation. But first, over to Maria.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.